This video will include spoilers related to Civil War, the new Alex Garland movie. Some of you may also find the content somewhat disturbing, so there's your warning before we get into the topic for today's video. Alex Garland's Civil War has just released and is being met with mostly positive reviews, though it does seem to be divisive given the subject matter and the depiction of graphic material. Alex Garland has made some of the most interesting movies in the last 2 decades, especially in the science fiction realm with Sunshine, Ex Machina, and Annihilation. By the way, if you loved Annihilation like I did, read the Southern Reach trilogy, which it's based on. Book 4 is about to come out, probably my favorite science fiction series. But Civil War is another awesome addition to his filmography, though is an especially hard film to watch. It follows a group of journalists traveling through a war-torn America in an attempt to interview and photograph the president before he's executed by the rebellion Western forces. The factions of the United States in Civil War are split between 4 groups. The Loyalist states, who, as the name suggests, are still loyal to the prior government. This actually accounts for the majority of states in the US. We then have the Florida Alliance, which accounts for 8 southeastern states, then the New People's Army of the Northwest, and lastly, the Western forces of California and Texas. The movie is set entirely in the Loyalist states, and you can actually follow the protagonist's route from New York to Washington, D.C. I'm going to go over the plot just because I think it's rather important for the context of discussing the actual lore and themes of Civil War. Our group of journalists is led by seasoned war photographer Lee Smith, who, through a few flashbacks, we see has been hardened by her work photographing conflicts overseas, meaning that she begins the movie with a very cynical mindset. We also have our partner Joel, who doesn't seem quite as jaded as Lee and doesn't value throwing himself into the conflict for the story as recklessly. Then we have Sammy, the most experienced and oldest of the group and kind of the voice of reason for most situations. Lastly, Jessie, the youngest and least experienced. She idolizes Lee and acts as the audience surrogate for most of the movie. We are seeing the horrors of war through her eyes, as shown literally by the photographs she snaps displaying some of the worst images through Civil War. We start the movie at a riot in New York City involving civilians, which is something that doesn't really shock Jessie or the audience. It's the same images many are familiar with seeing on social media, especially over the last few years. However, the riot ends with an explosion and some of the first shocking images that Jessie takes of the brutality caused by this war. We next go to a gas station where each of the attendants are heavily armed and are only willing to sell to specific customers, but however can be swayed by Canadian currency. That's an interesting detail, showing that the US dollar has become practically valueless in this new world. As an aside, I'm Canadian and I always find details like this funny. It's a pretty common trope that either Canada or Mexico remains somewhat stable while the US goes to hell in a handbasket during these disaster movies. I remember in World War Z, they actually go to Nova Scotia at the end of the movie, which is where I'm from, but anyway. At the gas station, we also see that the attendants have 2 people they know tied up who they've been torturing for some time. This again shocks Jessie, who is frustrated that she can't put her fear aside in order to take a picture. This leads to a firefight, which is somehow both visceral but also less shocking. It's more Call of Duty style with nameless and faceless soldiers firing on each other. We later learn more about the state of the world, or at least America, as the group encounters a refugee camp. They stand in stark contrast to some of the other groups we see who are simply trying to ignore the war as they've been pushed out of their homes and are not generally being protected by soldiers of any faction. We learn that cell service is currently inaccessible in America, while Wi-Fi and power are very unreliable as well. The team also, in one of the more enlightening moments of the movie, discovers an abandoned Christmas display before being shot at by a sniper. Well in cover, they find 2 men who Joel attempts to get information out of, but at the end of the day, we don't even learn which factions are firing at each other or why, and that's kind of the point. All we know is what we see in the situation. The faction the shooter belongs to doesn't matter. What does matter is that they're stuck and that someone needs to die in order for them to get out of it. This is the first time in the movie we don't see any graphic imagery during a conflict. We only see the view of the victor in the standoff. There's a recently released video where Alex Garland discusses some of the details with the scene over on Anatomy of a Scene, which I highly recommend if you want his thoughts on what's going on. I think it's important because one thing that's been going around is that Alex Garland made a mistake or made the movie weaker by not picking a side, and we'll loop back around on this once we've finished going over the story of Civil War. The film then introduces 2 additional journalists from Hong Kong. They show up initially appearing as a threat to the group and are extremely reckless, behavior that Jesse starts emulating, and what turns into somewhat of a moment of relief in a tense situation is abruptly ended by what is the most stressful moment of the film. We see this in the trailer. An unnamed soldier holds the group at gunpoint, demanding to know where they are from, and killing the 2 foreign journalists for not being American. The soldier and a few of his allies are burying a group of civilians which appear to have been killed for what we assume is a similar reason. This builds on the point of the previous scene, but focusing on the inverse. The journalists are now more concerned with walking away unharmed without answers rather than fishing for the truth, whereas these soldiers want to identify each member and execute them for their own reasons. They escape, however, Sammy is shot and dies prior to arriving at the front lines in Charlottesville. This event traumatizes Jesse and re-sparks trauma in the seasoned and emotionally repressed Lee. The 2 are changed characters at this moment, and both reflect how the audience might feel after witnessing this. The cold and focused Lee is now affected by the violence and death, while the inexperienced Jesse is desensitized and ready to throw herself into harm's way. The Western forces are ready to move in for an all-out assault on Washington, D.C., turning the city into a massive war zone. Here we see Lee more reluctant to move on while undergoing a panic attack amidst the chaos, while Jesse is laser focused, trying to get to as close to the action as possible for the best picture. This ends up resulting in Lee's death, who is trying to protect the reckless Jesse while she very emotionlessly photographs her idol's last moments. The movie ends with the Western forces shooting at the surrendering president as Jesse captures the brutality. So what does it mean for the future of America? What faction was right or wrong? Well, the movie doesn't tell us, and that is part of the reason why it's so important. Our protagonists are the storytellers for the world, documenting and capturing the conflict that the civilians we meet along the way are informed by. The president is depicted as being a fascist dictator who has dissolved several government organizations like the FBI, but by the end of the film is cowering on the ground begging for his life while executed by a group of soldiers as emotionless spectators capture his death. We know nothing about his politics or the politics of the rebellion group, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how the audience in the world of the movie would react to the photos taken by our protagonists. They are showing the story as they see it, or rather giving the audience only pieces they would find interesting. It doesn't need a reason to show the motives or justify the reasons why these 4 factions are all killing each other. Early in the film, Lee says she's dedicated her whole life to photographing war and the graphic violence in overseas conflicts as a cautionary tale, hoping that people would see and never replicate it at home. This seems to be overlooked by anyone trying to find a point of who was right or wrong. What's right or wrong is what the audience feels. Did the movie repulse you? Did you hate every moment watching the brutality? For a lot of people, it did its job and transported them to the very real place that probably felt much like home. As fascinating, interesting as Civil War is, learning about everything else in the world would spit in the face of what the movie is trying to convey to its audience. You don't want to root for the death or destruction that the war is causing. You're supposed to care about the people it's affecting. It also leads to the question, who would you be during the conflict? One of the people unhoused due to the war, or lucky enough to ignore that things are happening entirely? The politics and reasoning behind these factions doesn't matter. What matters is the effect of a conflict like this on average people. But those are our thoughts on the movie. Have you seen it? Do you plan to see it? Are you interested more in the story, the violence, the feeling? What? Let us know all that and more down below.